Warm welcome to everyone. Myself, Harish. I'm working as a assistant professor in Government Engineering College, Huinadagli. This is a video under LMS scheme regarding the Module 5, in which the regarding Module 5 for the 17 ME 742 for 7th semester mechanical students. There's the bearing materials. Uh, what are the outcomes of these bearing materials is the basics of materials. What are the bearing materials you are going to use? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of bearing materials? What are the real characteristics of the bearing materials, and so on. And now we will go through one by one. And before starting this real bearing materials, what do we mean by the bearing materials and characteristics? If the operating condition in a bearing are always ideal, if bearings always operated with the fluid film lubrication so that the rubbing surfaces are separated at all times by means of liquid lubricant, there would be no difficulty in selecting any type of proper bearing materials. But this case is only requirement of bearing material would be at low cost. In this case, only requirement of bearing material, adequate strength and rigidity, good heat conductivity. These are all the properties of the bearing materials. Unfortunately, such type of ideal conditions are almost never exist. Hence, before selecting any proper bearing material, we should know the type of characteristics of the bearing material required and what type of material we are going to choose. First one is the load carrying capacity. The load capacity, the allowable compressive strength the material can withstand without any appreciable change in shape is the primary deciding factor in deciding a bearing material. Means, see, load capacity is one type of characteristic of bearing material. Before elaborately, we are going to discuss what are the types of bearing characteristics. We have to go through the types of characteristics which are related with the bearing materials. There is compatibility and conformability and embeddability. That is the most important characteristics of bearing material. And compressive strength, fatigue strength, corrosion resistance, availability, cost, machinability, thermal conductivity, coefficient of friction, coefficient of expansion, and as well as modulus of elasticity. What I am going to say with respect to the load capacity, the allowable compressive strength of the material can withstand without any appreciable change in shape is the primary deciding factor while we are deciding any type of bearing material. In plain bearings, which are expected to have the following characteristics for the ease of functioning as well as satisfying the designing criteria, because designing is a very important parameter in which we are to have the load carrying capacity in order to the oil film which can able to sustain the load which is acting onto the bearing as well as the shaft, the strength to take care of the load speed combinations as well as the fatigue strength where the bearing materials are subjected to stress cycle as in internal combustion engines. The fatigue, what do you mean the fatigue? Fatigue is a successive application. Repeatedly we are going to apply the load in fatigue strength. And the retention of the strength characteristics of softer bearings material at temperature of operation which may rise within the design limit. The material must easily conform to the shape of the journal and should not be soft enough to allow the particulate contaminants to get the embedded load. And compatibility. The shaft and bearing materials in rubbing condition should not produce localized welds leading to the scoring or seizure of metallic surfaces may take place. Means when the load is too high, when there is a extend boundary lubrication exists, the amount of film can be observed by both parts. Hence, the seizure of metallic surfaces may take place. Hence, compatibility is a very important characteristic while we are selecting the bearing materials. Acute bearing shaft metal combination is necessary as usual. What are different types of materials we are going to use? The both materials, shaft as well as bearing, the corrosion resistance. The oxidized products of oils corrode many bearings alloys because the whatever the lubricants we are going to use, it should be free from corrosion. If we it should be free from oxidizing the products of shaft as well as the bearing. Some protection can be provided by forming a thin layer of anti-corrosion materials on the bearing alloy surfaces. This may be a little bit costlier process, but we have to use some protection in order to avoid the corrosion. Hence, the bearing material should render the corrosion resistance. And conformability and embeddability is the most important characteristics or properties of bearing materials. Conformability. It helps to accommodate the misalignment and increase the pressure bearing area, and it is relatively softer bearing alloys are better in their aspect. What do you mean by this conformability? The ability of the bearing material to yield to deformation under operation is referred to as conformability. And embeddability. It is the ability of a material to embed dirt and foreign particles to prevent the scoring and wear. Means if any particles which comes as a foreign elements within the shaft as well as the bearing, the ability of the metal to embed the dirt and foreign particles. That is the characteristics of this one. And materials with high hardness values have poor embeddability characteristics. Hence, we have to choose with normal, optimum range of hardness values for the materials which have this embeddability characters in order to avoid the embeddability characteristics. And the low efficient of friction, the material combinations of sliding surfaces along with the lubricant should provide the low friction coefficients for reducing the damage and lower running costs, because if the material possesses less coefficient of friction, then the amount of heat generation should be less. As the coefficient of friction is less, hence the generation of heat automatically reduces. Hence, this type of bearing material can possess this reduction in the temperature. Hence, this is the most important characteristics of the bearing material. And the low thermal expansion, it is the most important because as tribology is a study of rubbing surfaces, when we have the rubbing, automatically there is a temperature increases. The hence when the temperature increases, the thermal expansion should be as less as possible, because that is the reason the material should contain the low thermal expansion property in order to achieve the good efficiency of the system. And high thermal conductivity, it can able to dissipate more amount of the heat to the outer atmosphere, because if the material can easily able to quickly to remove the heat from the system, then there is a friction can reduces. Hence, the higher thermal conductivity characteristic is most important character. And wettability, it is an infinity affinity for lubricants so that they adhere to the spread to form a protective film over the bearing surface. And relatively hardness, the bearing material should usually be softer than that of the journal to prevent the short wear, but hard enough to resist the adhesives and abrasive wear of its own surface. The bearings are more easy to replace than shafts because it is a stationary element, hence we can easily able to remove the bearing. Hence, if one bearing is worn out, only that bearing needs to be replaced instead of whole shaft. Hence, that requires the dismantling of the whole engine. If we if you want to replace the shaft, you need to disassemble the whole system. Hence, the bearings are more easy to replace. Hence, the relative hardness of the bearing should be less compared to the shaft. And elasticity is a more important character because what do we mean elasticity? When you load to any particle, any material, it should regain to its original position after removing of the load. If the bearing material should possess this character, it should be elastic enough to allow the bearings to return to the original position after relieving of the load. Hence, we can able to have the maximum of elasticity in order to avoid the misalignment and as well as overloading, as well as the temporary distortion. And most importantly, cost. The economic consideration is the most important criteria while we are designing any aspect. While we are selecting any bearing material, the cost should be optimum. Hence, the economic consideration is the ultimate deciding factor while selecting the bearing materials. And the availability is also important. The material should be readily and sufficiently available, not only for initial installation, but also so facilitate the replacement in the event of bearing failure. The material should be readily available, sufficiently in large quantity. We should have any scarcity in order to installation as well as our replacement in order to completely achieve the effectiveness or efficiency of the system. And these are all the bearing characteristics which required by selecting the best and suitable bearing materials for working condition. And what are types of bearing materials alloys? What are the types of bearing materials which are come across in tribology? There are different types of bearing materials. There is a white metal, alkali ardent alloy, cadmium based alloys, copper lead alloys, bronzes, aluminum alloys, silver, sintered metals, and cast iron. These are all the types of bearing materials which are commonly used as a bearing materials. Aluminium alloys. Coming to this, aluminum is the most important, most versatile material because of its strength, fatigue strength, load bearing capacity, and thermal conductivity. As these are all the types of characteristics which can also be inculcated in aluminum. Hence, this is very best suited for almost all applications. Hence, aluminum alloys are commonly used as a bearing materials. It is comparatively not expensive than the Bavit materials. Most aluminum alloys contain tin as an element which remains in a free state to provide the better bearing surface. It is the strongest aluminum alloy used as aluminum silicon because in aluminum silicon, silicon is the most hardened material. It is its hardness is increases. As the hardness is more, we have the wearing, corrosion or rubbing is increases. Hence, the strongest aluminum alloy is used as aluminum silicon, and the thermal expansion is relatively high, and this restricts their usage at high temperature. This is the only disadvantage of aluminum alloy, as the thermal expansion should be as less as possible, but for the aluminum alloys it can possess the thermal expansion, and embeddability, conformability and compatibility are not very good with respect to this aluminum alloys. And cadmium and silver alloys, cadmium alloys offers a very good fatigue resistance and excellent compatibility characteristics. And cadmium, the corrosion resistance is very poor and are very expensive. The economically, the cadmiums are not going to preferable because of its cost. Silver, used as a deposited material on steel with an overlay of lead by using the coating techniques. This addition of lead improves the embeddability. That is the most important property what we have discussed already, and it also provides the anti-weld and anti-scoring properties. That is what the embeddability will give you. And the multi-layered bearings, steel is normally used as a backing material. To obtain the good durability and conformability and compatibility, a layer or coating of relatively softer material is put on a backing materials. Bearings consist of a thin layer of soft material, electroplated or cast on a layer of a bimetal bearings are known as a trimetal bearings. And multi-layered bearings at the thickness of overlay can be as low as 120 microns for babbits can be used. With increase of babbit thickness, the overall fatigue strength can be decreased. These are all the plain bearings with the sliding motion takes place. You see the figure, it clearly indicates the plain bearings with the sliding motion takes place. You see the isometric position of this fabricated bushing, roll formed strip bearing, and porous metal bearing, machine bushing, solid lubricant impregnated, and spherical bearing, and flanged bearings, which are have the sliding motion when you are going to operate in working conditions. And these are all the porous bearings which are it is not in as per VTU syllabus, but it is useful when we have the knowledge. The porous bearings, which are made up of powder metallurgy techniques by sintering the powder bronzes, iron, brass, graphite, these are all by using powder metallurgy and obtaining the requisite bearings housing shape by compressing the powder. This yields porous bearing housing, which is then impregnated with oil. The quantity of oil depends on the load and speed for which the bearing is used. What are the application of the porous bearings? You can see the application of these porous bearings are in mixtures, washing machines, garden equipments, etc. And rolled or stipped bearings are also types of bearings which are made by rolling or a sheet or a strip due to the nature of the manufacturing process. The bearing housing is a split requiring the various joining techniques to close the split. Sometimes they provided with a fiber lined cloth or a graphite fibers on the inside of the housing for friction reduction and improved strength. Among non-metallic bushes, rubbers and graphite have been traditionally used. Nylon is a nylon. It is one of the polymer. It is a valuable plastic material for bushing because of a low friction characteristics and has a low strength and is suitable for the low speeds due to the heating effect. Rubber bearings, non-metallic bearings. The rubber bearings comes under non-metallic bearing materials. These are all used where the quiet operation is desired large clearance and misalignment and curve. Third, found in bearings for propeller and rudder shafts of boats and ships. And found the rubber bearings are going to be found in water act as a lubricant or likely to be a contaminant. And wet rubber is very slippery, hence its usage in such situation can be reduces the friction. The carbon graphite is also on Teflon. These are two different types of bearing which are going to be used for different scenarios. The carbon graphite is used for food handling equipment in the textile industry because of the self-lubricating property. Carbon graphite it is a solid lubricant. Since its resistance to corrosion, it can be used in even in water. Coming to the Teflon, it is also one of the plastic or polymer, you can say, self-lubricating property and have a low friction, hence reinforcing with the fibers which improves the strength. By going through all these things, what we are going to have from this session is how we are going to select the bearing material according to their properties, where we are going to use exactly, in which condition and which environment we are going to use the bearing material, and what are the different types of common materials we are going to use. From this, I am going to conclude this session. We'll look the surface engineering in the next session. Thank you.